Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages, welcome to the Circus Maximus, where we are going to learn all about chariot racing. Woo, 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 woo. Yeah, all right. Hey, fantastic people on the other side of this video. It is Chariot Racing Day. Before we get on and we further our exciting trip into the world of Rome, I thought it would be kind of fun to take a look at what Romans did for fun. So, days when they were done working, they would head off to the Colosseum, the Circus Maximus, the Roman baths, and they'd have a great rest of their day. So, we are first starting our journey of days off. Or time spent off. And what would you do after your work? We're going to start that journey here at the Circus Maximus and talk about chariot racing. Oh yeah, this is going to be a wild ride. So, a circus. What is a circus? Well, you might think like circus, like, clowns and trapeze artists. No. Circus in Roman times was an open-air arena for public events, specifically chariot racing. That was what happened most of the time. Of all the circi, that is plural for circus. The Circus Maximus was the most important and most prominent in all of Rome, which meant if you were a chariot racer in another circus, at another place, and you won a bunch, your goal, your whole, dream in life would be to race at the Circus Maximus. Oh yes, it was pretty epic. There we go. The Circus Maximus, where was it? Well, it sat in the valley between Palatine and Aventine Hills. Take a look where that little arrow is pointing. I hope this piece of paper looks familiar to you. Circus Maximus, right smack dab in the middle, right in that valley. And it was large. How large? Well, let's tell ya. It was about 2,000 feet long, about 400 feet wide, had seating for 300,000 people. Guys, this is larger than, this is 3 times larger than the largest NFL stadium. Think about that for those of you who've been to games. 3 times the size. Oh, yeah. If you were thinking those stadiums were epic, this was epic. Now, Julius Caesar, who's a really cool guy who we're going to be learning about shortly, he actually added the tiered seating. So it was originally only this high. See how it goes right up to there? Fantastic. It was pretty short. But wow, by the time Julius Caesar showed up, Rome was huge, and there just wasn't room for everyone. Therefore, they needed to add more. Oh my goodness, they needed to add more. So he is responsible for this extra tiered seating way up here. Now, in these little archway galleyways through there, of course, there'd be food vendors. Think about going to Viking Stadium or going to the Twin Stadium. When you're not sitting out here watching the game and watching the events, you're absolutely inside getting something to eat or getting memorabilia. Exactly. Now, sports memorabilia back in the day wasn't very much like sports memorabilia today, but, we'll talk about that in one of our next slides. But as you can see, there was seating for so many people. It was huge. Some other circuits around the world. There's the Circus of Merida, which to this day is still a giant round open oval. A drawing of the Circus Flaminius, the Circus of Nero, and a modern day what's left of the Circus of Tyre. Now, these were all named for people who built the circus. So if you put lots and lots of money into building it, you got to name it. And most of the time, well, you would name it after, that's right, yourself. Why? Because this is how you were remembered back in the ancient days. You had things that named after yourself. Mm-hmm. So now we talked about the building. Before we jump into this, I also want to point out that the circus wasn't for everyone. Um, Ladies, sorry, you were mainly if you were allowed to show up, and if you showed up, you could only sit in the way, way, way top seats, way at the top. Sports were kind of a guy thing back in ancient Rome. But it's okay. There's some cool things coming up for the ladies in a little bit. Just, nowadays, of course, you could totally watch the chariot races. Just not always in Rome. The chariots, by the way, were open back and were typically pulled by 4 horse teams. They do believe that some horse teams were, sometimes they ran with just 2. They could run also with 6 or 8 horses pulling a chariot. That seems like a lot of horses. During the chariot races, there would either be 4, 6, 8, or 12 teams of horses that competed. They began in starting gates, 12 starting gates, at the wider end of the circus. So one end of the circus was very wide. They started in starting gates just like in horse racing today. That was supposed to be me pretending I'm playing a trumpet, um, blowing the starting call for horse racing. Yeah. Anyway, so they started the starting gates, and the starting gates would open, and the horses would run out. Like horse racing, except chariot racing. Yeah. Now, the chariot driver's clothing was color coded according to his faction or according to his team, and that would help all the spectators to keep track of the race's progress. And you would pick a team that you were a fan of. You might pick the red team, or the white team, or the blue team, or the green team. And the chariot racer's clothing would depict what team he was on. So, yeah, there were teams. Now, while there were originally only 2 teams or 2 factions, white and red, to represent the seasons of summer and winter, respectively, there ended up eventually becoming 4 different factions. So red, white, green, and blue. Each team could have up to 3 chariots in a race. If you had 12 racers, you might have, well, red, white, green, and blue, 12 racers. Do some multiplication. 4 times 3 is 12, or 12 divided by 4 is 3. You could have 3 chariots in a race. So not only would you be racing as a chariot racer, not only would you be racing for individual victory, but you'd also be racing for a team victory. And specific teams or factions came from different stables. So whatever team you were on, say you were on the red faction with a red team, your horses would be at the red stables. You would have a specific barn that you would only be allowed to train from. Members of the same team often collaborated with each other against other teams, such as, slamming in on either side to cause a team to crash, and forcing a group of horses to crash into the spina, or the middle of the circus, which was a completely legal tactic and encouraged. Oh, yeah, they encouraged crashes and accidents to happen while on the course because it was more dramatic and exciting for the spectators. Yeah. Now, just like in sports teams today, drivers, which is the person who is racing with the horses, that's what they're called, drivers could switch teams or be traded, a lot like athletes get traded back and forth, in our current times. So just because they were on the red team this week, they could be on the white team next week, or they could be on the blue team, or they might change sometimes in the middle of a competition, and they would put a different color toga on and be ready to go. Uh, and that all had to do with, owners and who was in charge, and who got along with who, and the politics, and who had more money, and it was a whole bunch of things. Same reasons, really, why people get traded around today. Now, I brought up the spina, which is Latin for spine. So spina means spine. The spine of the Circus Maximus is the center ring right here. That center ring, called the spina, that's the barrier that ran down the middle. It was more than just a separator. It had decorations and trophies from all parts of the empire, as well as statues and working fountains. It was very, very, very well decorated. The decorations and trophies, many things that were brought over from lands that Rome had conquered, were placed on the spina as a way to show off Rome's greatness. So they would conquer a land, they'd say, oh, that's a cool statue, let's bring that with us and bring that to the spina. In the very center, in later Rome, the giant obelisk from Egypt that was brought over by the Emperor Augustus was placed in the very center. And although we haven't talked about him yet, we will. Oh, we will. But just know that he brought a very gorgeous giant obelisk, which is a big centerpiece right there. He brought that over from Egypt. Now, the reason the center area was cluttered, it was cluttered on purpose, guys. So that if you were on one side of the stadium of the Circus Maximus and the horses were on the other, you couldn't see what was going on, which led to more suspense. You saw them go around the corner, and then you're sitting there going, oh my goodness, where are they? My team was in the lead, but oh no. And then you're watching the other people on the other side, and you're noticing their reactions. And then, the crowd goes wild. Oh, was there a crash? Oh no, what's going on? Did the lead change? Oh, what happened? And you don't know until they come around the other side. So it's all in a way to just promote drama and suspense and excitement and make it more interesting. So if this were a drawing of the spina, at the end of the spina, way over on one end over here, there'd be a set of 7 metal dolphins. And these were to honor Neptune, of course, and a set of 7 eggs. The dolphins had the eggs in their mouth, and they would be taken down one at a time and flipped over as the chariots lapped around the track. So it was a visual for people to see how many laps were remaining. Typically, they wouldn't just go one lap. They would go a few laps. So you'd have to keep track, and this was a great way to keep track of how many laps you had to go, not just for the spectators, but as the drivers as well, so they weren't confused and could keep racing. A computer animated view of obelisk in the center. They had there was a statue of Caesar, working fountains, some other statues, lots of clutter in that center area, and lots of space from one end to the other. So the closer you were, the better chance you had of really getting into the action, but anywhere was a good place to sit in the Circus Maximus. So at the end of each turn, turns were really tight. So you're racing along, racing along, and all of a sudden, you have a complete U-turn. A complete U-turn. Not just like this little turn, like you're just turning onto another road. That's a 90-degree turn. You're doing a 180-degree turn. 180-degree turn at crazy fast speeds with horses. Oh, and by the way, did I tell you? The ground is coated with sand. Have you ever tried driving around with a vehicle in sand? Sand's not good. Have you ever tried to run and race in sand and stop quickly and then slide or topple over? Sand was very unsecure footing, and very tight turns meant for lots of opportunity for crashes. Already talked about the rest of it, the 7 eggs on top with the 7 dolphins, and up to 12 teams racing at a time. And they'd be racing somewhere between 3 to 4 miles. Sometimes races would be shorter, maybe only a couple turns around. Sometimes they'd be all the way up to 7 dolphins. Maybe they'd do the 7 dolphins twice. It all depended on what race it was and how many teams there were. Can you imagine 12 teams racing at a time? That seems like a recipe for disaster. Here's a better picture of the dolphins. This one obviously has more than 7, but just an idea of there'd be an egg in the dolphin's mouth, the dolphin would get flipped forward, and then you know that lap was done. So obviously, racing was crazy dangerous. Ramming into other chariots, although technically it was a foul, it was common and expected. And what were they going to do? Stop the race and have you start over? No, not going to happen. So it happened all the time. Also, checking a chariot into the metal barrier, the middle barrier, also something that happened all the time. Drivers, many times, whipped their horses to make them go faster. Sometimes, if another driver got too close, they'd whip that driver too. Also, well, a foul, but did it happen? Yes, it did. It was, although there were rules to follow, there were also, how do I say it? The most important rule was win, which meant all the other rules didn't matter as long as you won. So we talked about ramming into people. We talked about the sharp turns. Another thing to keep in mind, the chariots would wrap the reins of the horses around their wrists and sometimes around their bodies so they could have better control over the turning of the horses and the galloping horses and how fast to make them go. But because of this, if something happened and they crashed and their horses kept running, they would be dragged behind their horses as well. So it got really dangerous. Now, the drivers typically would bring a knife along and strap it to themselves. So in case they needed to get out of the reins, they could cut themselves free. But you know how long it takes a knife to cut through leather? Imagine trying to do that while being dragged behind horses. Oh, yeah, and by the way, there's also other chariots that are trying to squash you. Yeah, kind of dangerous. So if you got thrown from the chariot, you didn't have a good chance of living. Most chariot drivers were slaves, but many times you could buy your freedom. Although that typically didn't happen because although chariot racing looked like fun and thousands of people loved it, it was very dangerous and most people died in their early 20s. So a few years of racing and one bad crash later, that's all it took. Now, people back in the day supported a team or a faction just like you would support a modern team, wearing their colors at the races, going to local clubhouses and celebrating after a victory, complaining after a loss, talking about how this driver needed to be traded, how they needed better horses, complaining about, when they lost, what they could fix if they were in charge, all the typical things that people do today with our sports teams. Even Pliny the Younger, who was a philosopher and a writer, who we have lots of information about Rome because of him, wrote down, "I am the more astonished that so many thousands of grown men should be possessed again and again with a childish passion to look at galloping horses and men standing upright in their chariots. If indeed they were attracted to the swiftness of the horses or the skill of the men, one could account for this enthusiasm. But in fact, it's a bit of cloth they favor, a bit of cloth that captivates them. And if during the running the racers were to exchange colors, their partisans would change sides and instantly forsake the very drivers and horses whom they were just before recognizing from afar and clamorously saluting by name." Basically, in his fantastic paragraph, he states that although people are celebrating these factions and these teams, they're not actually celebrating the horses. They're not actually celebrating the drivers. They're celebrating their team, the cloth, the color of this cloth. They're celebrating everyone. In modern days, you could say they're celebrating everyone who's a Viking. Why? Because they're a Viking. As soon as that one guy goes off to another team, not going to celebrate him anymore. We're going to celebrate the new guy that comes in to take his place because we're celebrating the team. So, any modern parallels? Yeah. Like everyone who loved Brett Favre from the Green Bay Packers until he became a Viking. And then they hated him because he went to a different team. He was still the same guy, but he picked a different color to wear. So you're not really celebrating the people, you're celebrating the colors. Something to think about. So, were there famous chariot racers? Absolutely, there were famous chariot racers. The most famous of all the chariot racers in ancient Rome was Diocles, who had 1,462 victories out of his 4,257 races. And we do know this because the Romans, although they didn't write a lot down, they certainly wrote down very important feats of greatness, like this. He also had an additional 1,438 second place wins. So he was, 50% chance that he was going to win or take second place in all of his races. He had quite a few come from behind victories, where for most of the race he would be at the back end, and then as it got closer to the end, he would work his way up and win. And therefore, he became a favorite of the Roman Empire. It was dramatic. It was exciting. He's in last place. What is he going to do to get up to first place? Oh, the tension, the drama. Oh, it was incredible. They thought he was fantastic. He was the champion of charioteers, is what they called him. He had quite a long life of chariot racing, which was kind of unique. It wasn't really something that happened a lot. He began racing when he was 18. He didn't win his first race until 2 years later. And then he retired 24 years later. That's a long time racing and not dying. I know. Crazy, right? Yeah. He retired from racing and was one of the richest men in Rome. His earnings were approximately around $70 million, which ends up being about 34 million sesterces in Roman coins. And his net worth, historians have figured out, was probably around $130 million. That's insanely a large amount of money, yes. But he was very famous because he was also a showman. And he would, wave to the crowds, and he was very boisterous and very personable, and just a fun guy who happily enjoyed fame and was, was always out in front of people, and therefore very famous. He was someone that everyone really looked forward to watching race. If his name was in the racing program, oh, you better believe people would show up and it would sell out the Circus Maximus. Uh, Although he didn't have the most races won out of everyone, he was just that well loved. Another famous racer, Pontius Epaphroditus, with 1,467 victories. Not much is known about him except for that. But he certainly wasn't as well loved as Diocles. Then there is Pompeius Musculosus, and although he is said to have 3,559 victories, they might not all be completely valid. Some of those might have been races that were set up for him to win, because he was good friends with the emperor at the time, who might have helped him out in a few races. And then there was Scorpus, who was also an incredibly famous chariot racer. And he had over 2,000 victories. But he died when he was 27, so he didn't have that long lifespan that Diocles did. He started out as a slave, as most chariot racers unfortunately did, but was able to buy his freedom. And after buying his freedom, he remained a chariot racer. Why? Because he was good. And because he was good, the money was good. He was given several laurel wreath headbands, and they're a laurel wreath, they sit on top of your head, and they were given for exemplary performance as a racer. It was said that fans threw him money after he won a race. They would throw money down onto the floor of the Circus Maximus. And although his death was not talked about and wasn't written down, more than likely it came from one of those shipwrecks. They called all crashes at the Circus Maximus a shipwreck. And I can imagine it's probably what it looked like. Shipwreck, a giant crash, and probably no survivors. So what happened to the Circus Maximus now? Well, it fell into disuse around the 6th century. It was taken apart. The spina, all of the statues from the spina and the obelisks were relocated to different parts of the world. And now the flattened area, has been turned into a park in Rome. You can see it goes a long ways back. And right now, though, from what I've been reading up about it, they are starting to excavate some pieces. They're finding that there's many pieces that are buried underground. So they're starting to do some excavation work and dig up some of the ancient seats and entryways to restore them as best they can. But for the most part, the Circus Maximus is gone, and very few things remain from it. On that note, there is a video clip that I'm going to send along with this video, and it is a clip from the movie Ben-Hur. You might not have ever heard of that movie. All you need to know is it is a clip with a chariot race. Now, a few things to note in that clip. One, I want you to look for all the times that foul play is used. Anytime that there's maybe some cheating going on and some not so nice things being done to other charioteers. Keep a lookout for times when other chariots break down, people being hurt or run over. Keep in mind it's a movie. No one was hurt during the movie. Take a look for someone who possibly might be getting dragged behind their horses when their chariot breaks. And the dolphins are going to be shown, the dolphins with little eggs. And then the one really cool little trivia fact that you need to keep a lookout for is there is a time when the chariot, Ben-Hur's chariot, jumps over another chariot. And it looks like Ben-Hur flips over and almost falls out. Well, this movie was made back in the 70s. This was before stuntmen were a thing in movies and before special effects. So this entire scene is actually happening, with the exception of there's 2 times someone gets run over and you can tell it's a mannequin, it's not a real person. But everyone else here is doing their own stunts. The chariot goes over this jump and Ben-Hur almost flips out of the chariot. That all really happened. And he could have been crushed by his own chariot, but he hangs on. And the director thought it was dramatic enough and really cool that they left it in the scene. It really wasn't supposed to happen, and it did. Still, very cool. So take a look at this chariot race. It's pretty intense. Imagine what it would be like with 12 teams of horses in a real life scenario. That is all from me on the Circus Maximus and Chariot Racing. I hope you enjoyed. See you soon.